Pridecast. This is Peter Ray Allison, yours truly, for Geek Pride, no less, talking. Well, it's just me today, no Matt, because I wanted this interview all to myself because I'm greedy like that. Basically, I have been wanting to do this interview now for years. It is this month, August 2023, is the 30th anniversary of Mage the Ascension, the role playing game, part of the World of Darkness games from White Wolf. And joining me on the podcast today is Phil Brucato, otherwise known as Satya, who is the lead developer for Mage, or more accurately, was the lead developer of Mage. And sorry, I should say, my apologies. And yeah, Satya, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm one of a number. I had just put up on TikTok the other day a video of the various people who have been lead designer for Mage, and because I also included Dark Ages Mage, Mage of the Awakening, and Victorian Mage, that ended up being a whole lot more designers than even I was aware of. But I am the person who's handled Mage longest. I was originally hired in 1993. Did it until 1999 when Jess Hennig and I transferred, Heinig and I kind of transitioned over a few books. I continued doing Sorcerer's Crusade until 2000, and then did another book, not in the lead designer capacity, but just as an author with Bill Bridges in 2003, I think, and then rejoined Mage, or rather returned to Mage, because at that point it was under a different company, with Mage 20, and worked on Mage 20 as lead designer between 2012 and 2019, and then transitioned again to just being an author at that point. And I'm still working on it through the Storyteller's Vault, and I have a number of books that are still in the pipeline that I've done, but with other lead designers. So I've been associated with Mage for the better part of 30 years, but I haven't always been the lead designer of Mage. There have been quite a few people
You
who've had
are that damn Mage guy.
that. Yeah. It started, that label started as a joke, and then it just kind of stuck. So yeah, kind of like Satyr for that matter.
Yeah.
My preferred name at this point, Satyr or Satyros, started as a joke with Ian Lemke when I worked on Changeling First Edition. I had written the Kiths entry in that, and Ian asked me, how was it? Would you like? And I said, I love that. I especially related well with the Satyrs for some reason. Hey, Les, he says, that's because you are a Satyr, Phil, and that stuck. And then after I left White Wolf, I got a Satyr laughing pan tattoo, and just started going by Satyr around 99, 2000. And the name stuck, and it just suits me much better than Phil. So that's what and my friends in Greece christened me Satyros in 2011. And I was just like, Satyros Brucato, that has a ring to it. So that's been my professional name ever since.
Yeah, but it's like there is something to be said about like having a name that has a certain ring to it.
Yeah.
I mean, like my name is Peter Allison, but I found
Mhm.
adding the Ray to it just adds a
Yeah.
rhythm.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
but anyway, again, we're going off topic. But is what is I mean for the viewers that have not experienced the wonder that is Mage, what is Mage the Ascension?
Mage the Ascension is a game about remaking the reality that you are given into the reality that you need.
That's
It's a
yeah,
game
that's
about empowerment.
yeah. That's a very succinct. I mean, what I find is no, Mage is very different to other role-playing games in the World of Darkness. The example is you are in Vampire, you're a vampire, you're a monster. You know, in Werewolf, you're a
10 foot
werewolf.
tall rage,
Yeah,
10 foot
you're
tall, 10
yeah,
foot tall Captain Planet with a
yeah,
body count. Yeah.
yeah. And in Wraith, you are a ghost. You're someone who is dead. But
Mhm.
in Mage, you're still human. You have the power to move mountains, but you're still human. And it's a game about hope. I mean, that was such a fascinating realization when I read like that Mage is very different to other roleplay games in the World of Darkness.
Thank you. Yeah, and and as we talk about in the introduction for Mage 20th, you can still be a monster. In fact, and I go into this in more detail in the Book of the Fallen and Fallen Companions. Humans really are the worst monsters ever. Uh, And the core struggle in Mage is not technocracy versus traditions, because that's something that can be part of the meta plot, or you can reject it completely. It's not about um, wizards versus monsters or anything like that. It's really a game about pitting, about you and yourself. The biggest monster in Mage is the one in the mirror.
Yeah, I mean that rings true of something Garth Ennis once said, who was writing Hellblazer. He said, like, no,
Mhm.
for all these factors that you got these demons, devils, vampires, and absolute, horrific creatures, but the true horror is people.
Yeah, yeah, and it's I the famous quote from No Exit by Jean Paul Sartre, uh, Sartre, um, is both hell is other people, and in greater context, hell is other people unless you can unless you figure out how to get along with each other. And both are true with Mage, because in Mage the struggle, as in Vampire to a degree, the struggle is to have the potential to be a monster and not to become one. The metaphor of the path runs through my work with Mage, which is the idea that um, you start off in basically in a state of innocence, more or less, and you awaken literally at some point to the realization that you have the power to remake reality in your image. And the path and the various different ways that can go is, so what are you going to do with that power? Are you going to indulge yourself? Are you going to destroy your enemies, whoever those enemies might be perceived to be? Are you going to make yourself a better person? Are you going to make the world a better place? And if so, and here's the real conflict within Mage in a social standpoint, what does better world look like? Because everybody has different ideas about what that looks like, and they have different ideas about what that better world should cost. And that's really where the various different factional conflicts come in, is because you've got some people who think a better world looks like a world under technological control, where everything is monitored, where everything is, where the random elements are filtered out, where the human animal is upgraded to a better version, um, where ignorance is not bliss, unless of course it's the ignorance that the authorities tell you, because the authorities have the ability to decide what's better for you than you do. Or is that better world a world in which nature is the greatest law and humans bow to that? Is it a world where you can constantly upgrade yourself through technology to a greater sense of being and a greater sense of realization? Is it one where everybody can unlock the power of wonder? Is it one where people all unite into a single great faith, with the one source of all things? Is it one in which we realize that we're all mad here and that's okay? The various different factions in Mage have very, very different views of what that better world looks like and how to bring it about. And those views can get pretty fucking bloody if you're not careful.
Yeah, and when you have the power to move a mountain, having an argument with someone has to be very nuanced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, how did you first become involved in Mage way back in way like the heady days in 1993?
1993. Well, it actually goes back. My involvement with Mage and White Wolf actually goes back to before White Wolf. Bill Bridges and his brother John and I were in a group called Games Masters at Virginia Commonwealth University, which was 40 years ago this month in 1983. And
Wow.
Games Masters had some really radical for that time ideas of what role playing games could be. We viewed role playing games not just as, kill orcs, get treasure, go up levels, but as um, shared storytelling and potential mythology, and an avant-garde art form. And so when um, over the course of this, uh, the older, or rather the younger brother of one of the founders of Games Masters, the founder being Daniel Greenberg, the younger brother being Andrew Greenberg. Andrew Greenberg got involved with White Wolf when the White Wolf Game Studios was first coming together in 1990, 1991. And so he hired Bill in 1991 to work on Vampire as a freelancer. And then the following year, Bill started in as the werewolf developer in 1992. And 31 years ago, hired me, who at that point I had already been professionally writing for several years, hired me as a writer on Werewolf. Fast forward a year later to that, to 1993, my life was at a complete dead end. It was chaos. I hated everything, and knew I needed a change. And so I said, I want to do your job, but with Mage. At that point, Mage was undergoing a hasty rewrite into what is now, Mage First Edition, and I interviewed for the job. And 30 years ago this month, I got it. And at that point, I asked Ken Cliff when I started. I said, how much creative latitude do I have with this? He said, he's like, as long as you don't immediately throw out everything that's in the book, it's all yours. We don't have the slightest idea what to do with it. So basically, I was like, well, I've been involved with let's say metaphysical subcultures since my teens. I've always been fascinated by magic, faith, religion, and the ways in which those things can be used and abused. I have a lot of real life experience with those things as well. And so when I started with Mage, I was like, I was fascinated by Stuart Wick, the original creator of Mage, had several absolutely fantastic, absolutely radical ideas. The biggest one being that the mage is is change personified, essentially. And that magic is not a series of combat maneuvers or a series of spells. Magic is an extension of the mage. And I was like, that, fuck yes, that, because that is what made Mage different from everything else. And I was also very influenced in my approach to, so, okay, so what does that mean? By the film Rashomon, Akira Kurosawa's film Rashomon, which is about the subjective nature of truth, and about how everybody's version of truth is a little different. When I looked at when I extrapolated on Stewart's ideas of different mage factions as different ways of viewing the truth, I said, okay, well, different ways of viewing the truth are going to have very, very different realities. And so that, by extension, created Mage as a game of warring realities. And warring realities, as we are living through right now in this world at this moment, warring realities can be really fucking messy.
Absolutely, because we now have that phrase alternative facts, alternative
Yeah,
truths.
exactly. Alternative facts. Fuck, that's frightening.
Yeah.
And that was one of the big influences on Mage 20. Was okay, rather than, because at that time when when Rich Thomas started Onyx Path and picked up on the idea of doing Mage 20th anniversary, and he and I met. We decided first thing we wanted was what we called a Mage for all Mage fans. Folks who are familiar with Mage might remember that there was a massive edition war between the second edition and the revised edition. And we wanted to heal the edition war and make it so that Mage would be something that everybody, theoretically everybody, I mean, obviously not everybody's going to enjoy it, but
Yeah.
most Mage fans would go, yeah, this is my Mage. And one of the big ways that we did that was to make the meta plot, make it meta plot neutral, give a number of different a number of different potential elements of the direction the meta plot could go, but never force the players to go, this is. We present a number of options, goes, this is what it could be. What do you want to do with it?
Yeah.
And
Because the different editions of Mage are surprisingly, out of all the other kind of World of Darkness games, they are the most diverse.
yeah,
I found. So, for example, is the first edition is just full of ideas. The second edition I find is probably more focused and streamlined. I think it's more focused in terms of ideas.
mhm.
Revised was grounded, very grounded on earth compared to the more kind of like wild imaginings of especially the first edition. And
Mhm.
Tony kind of took all that and just said, this is what it can be. It's what you
Mhm.
want it to be is your reality.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And well, and when we were putting that together for the 20th anniversary, I read through the entire series, reread the books that I had worked on, read the books that I hadn't worked on, and I spent a lot of time talking with Mage fans. I had put together a brain trust who are credited in the book, but also just went on the forums a lot and was like, what do you like? What do you want? Also, be in between the time that I had left Mage. Actually, really, I started asking people what they wanted to see from Mage from the first my first day on the job at Gen Con in 1993, asking people, what do you want from it? What do you want to see? And even after I left Mage as the line developer, lead designer, I still had people coming up to me, at conventions, and sometimes just like at literally at bars or at parties going, oh my god, you're that guy. So one of the reasons I changed my name actually was because I got a lot of, oh my god, you're that guy. And I didn't want to be that guy. I wanted to be known for me, not for what I had done in the 1990s.
Yeah.
But anyway, I looked at the legacy that Mage had and said, how can we make a game that lives up to that? And for that I went to the fans.
Yeah. So basically, I mean, that kind of asked me the question is, or makes me ask the question is, when you first joined Mage and like what was the lead developer on the second edition, what was your initial thinking? How did you talk to the fans, but how did you kind of move it forward, so to speak?
For the first few months and the first few books, it was, oh shit. Bill Bridges and I were just talking about this on my Facebook earlier today. The pace at which we were creating content for those books was insane. Back in the early days, it we were putting out for the core lines, the 5 core lines. We were putting out a book a month for years, and that was the pace that you needed in order to keep the lights on and the doors open and the salaries paid back in the 90s, because role-playing games were considered at that point a disposable medium, and your company was only as viable as your next issue, your next product. We were the role-playing game market was based on the comic book market, whereas this issue, so we were just like that. So there wasn't a whole lot of thought and planning in that first year. There was a lot of consolidation and a lot of brainstorming. Um, Mage First Edition uh, is very, there were a lot of ideas presented, but there's not a lot of framework or substance to it. There are 10 groups, 9 traditions, and another group that is sort of a tradition, but not a tradition. And there are 5 technocracy conventions, and there are the Marauders and the Nefandi, but there's not a lot of framework for who these people are, how these groups function, what historical events led to them taking the forms that they did. So one of my first jobs as developer, other than to get the books done, involved getting together a group of collaborators and figuring out the framework, the backstory, the meta plot, whatever you want to call it, the history that turned, you know, I'm going to deal with the spirits into this, but into the Dream Speaker tradition, or the Order of Hermes tradition, or the Verbena tradition, depending on how you approach dealing with witch spirits, or the Celestial Forest tradition, how you dealt with witch spirits, how the different approaches to magic became the factions of the 20th century, was something that was myself, Bill Bridges, Sam Chupp, Judith McLaughlin, Kathy Ryan, Brian Campbell, Owl going back. Turns out that's not his actual. Anyway, I'm not going to go off on that tangent. Let's just, yeah. Anyway, Nikki Ray, Jackie Cassada, um, and uh, Chris Hind. I think Chris Hind was part of that as well. But we brainstormed a lot on how do these pieces hang together. Travis Williams, um, how do these pieces hang together, and what's that history look like? Fortunately, I'm a history buff, So I was able to go, okay, this historically looks like this. This historically looks like this. If we move this way over into this, and we made that 20th century, and we gave that 20th century mage a historical framework that literally went back to prehistory, which created a gargantuan meta plot. But one of the first things that I address in Mage Made Easy is you don't need to use any of it. You could use all of it, which would be insane, but you don't actually need to use any of it because the core of Mage is not the traditions. It's not the technocracy. It's not the meta plot or the history. The core of Mage is you have the power to change the world. What are you going to do with it?
Yeah, it's all about the player's impact on the world, not the tradition's
Yeah,
impact. Yeah, and
exactly.
yeah, and I think I mean I'm about to, well, in a few months' time, I'll be running a game of Mage with some friends who've never played Mage
Mm-hmm.
before, who've never played World of Darkness before, and I'm just
Mm-hmm.
going, I'm just almost chucking out the whole tradition and technocracy
Yeah,
policy, and just saying,
throw it out.
you're mages,
Yeah.
you're friends. You just happen to be in the same area and just notice each other's a little bit different from everyone
Mm-hmm.
else. And oh, and that's things happening over there that you have no idea about.
Mm-hmm.
And off you go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the revised the revised grounded earlier, and the reason I laughed is because that's both a that's a source of both amusement and consternation for me because two of the books most associated with grounded real world mage were actually books that I did during the second edition era, Destiny's
Yeah.
Price and Orphan
Destiny's Prime.
Survival Guide.
Yeah, I've got
Um,
Destiny's Price up there.
Cool.
Yeah.
It's very dated because I mean we wrote it in 1994, so you know it's reflective of the crack war era, and some of it
Yeah.
comes across pretty off the wall now. But the scary thing is it was, aside from the magical elements, it was absolutely grounded in reality, and that was one of the things that in the first edition it was, you know, flying through all of these
Mhm.
different worlds and doing all of this different stuff, and I am myself had practice with, you know, practice and experience with metaphysical subcultures, witch wars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I had just come out of living in a bad neighborhood
Yeah.
and being really poor and working shitty jobs and going, what do you do if you wake up with the power to change reality? As in a way I did in
Yeah.
1993. Um, and this is what you grew up with. You know, you didn't grow up, you know, in a Horizon realm, or you didn't grow up in a wizard's castle, and you're not part of a bloodline of witches or something like that. What if you worked a shitty job and then one day woke up with the power to change the world? How would that affect you? And how would that how would that influence your view of the world? And I made that the center of my approach on a lot of levels to Mage. So on one hand, I had this huge tapestry to work with, and there were books like the Book of Worlds and Horizon Stronghold of Hope. But to me, the books that mattered the most and came the most from the heart were Technocracy Syndicate, Cult of Ecstasy tradition book, Dream Speakers tradition book, Destiny's Price, Orphan Survival Guide, that are all about having a shitty life until the moment comes when you have the chance to change it.
Yeah, I mean, I love that dichotomy between you have the
Yeah.
power of reality, but you're still human. You are still
Yeah.
fundamentally human and all that it brings. And
Mm-hmm.
that is such a source of such good storytelling because it's very human.
Yeah. And that was part of my approach too, to go back to your earlier question, because the mage in its initial appearance was very slippery and hard to hold on to, because it was a lot of ideas. Part of what I did with what those first few years was to focus on you. It's about you, and that's where the idea of presenting the tradition and convention books, that was going back to the influence of Rashomon on Mage. To each tradition book and each convention book was portrayed not as a series of objective statements, the virtual adepts believe this, but it was portrayed through the eyes of someone coming into that group and the experience of that a person coming into that group. So you were seeing what reality looked like to them. And sometimes that worked better than others.
Yeah.
It was definitely a process. But but that idea, um, so when Mage first came out, it was greeted with a combination of "Oh my god, this is awesome," combined with "What the fuck is this?" And there you had the two reality, you're right, the two realities. We had those two reactions. Some people are like, "Oh my god, you can change vampires into soap bubbles. This is awesome," and other people are like, "I don't even know how to play this." And part of my challenge there, if I wanted to keep my job, so um my this is about 3 4 months into work. This is one of the scary things about working in the same office as the warehouse, is that when the returns come back from the stores of the unsold product, you get to see them. And I just had gone back into the warehouse for something, and I saw this huge palette covered in Mage books. I was like, "Oh my god, what's that?" And one of the warehouse guys was like, "I don't know. I guess people just didn't want to play it." And I freaked the fuck out. I went back to my office and I was just a wreck. And I was like, "Fuck, man, I'm gonna get fired. I'm gonna get the Mage is gonna crash and burn because nobody understands it. Nobody's gonna want to play it." And my next to the office, my roommate, collaborator, and the guy in the office next to mine, Brian Campbell, talks me down. He comes into my office. I'm just like, "Fuck, man, I'm gonna go back to working in the fucking shoe store and stuff." And Brian's like, "No, no, it's okay. It's okay. This happens. This happens. Breathe." Okay. Can understand, mages, it's a lot for people to take in. What can we do to make people want to, how can we get people to want to buy it? Fortunately, I also had a background in the theater. Originally I was an actor between about 1980 81 and about 80 88, I think 89, when I realized that I just wasn't going to be able to make a living at it. But I trained in that as in college. I have an acting degree. And I thought, focus it on "You are the mage," rather than "Mages are reality." It's like, you are the mage. What does being a mage mean to you? And that snapped everything into focus for me. And that's really been the thing that's guided both my vision and the vision of the people who've worked with me or worked on the line since me. From that point onward, was you are the mage.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one thing I found when I've been introducing Mage to new players is that they don't appreciate that you don't get spells as such in Mage. It's a sphere system. Like, no, each different sphere has a different kind of area of expertise. And again, like, well, so where's the fireballs? Well, no, 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 you don't. You have areas, spheres of influence. That's it. And you combine them.
Yeah.
And it's just like, it's kind of like life. You can detect it, then you can modify it slightly, then you can create minor ones, then you can modify larger ones, and then you create big ones. It's like it's graded spheres of influence. And when you kind of explain like that, and said you're not a spell like your wizard with a robes and a spell book, forget that. You are someone who believes fundamentally that they can change reality, and their magic is just them changing that reality to suit their will. And kind of it took a few kind of explanations explaining that, you are not a traditional mage, no, wizard with robes and a hat and all
Or
that.
you can be.
You can, yeah,
if that's the way you think magic works, you can totally do that.
Yeah, you could be like a hermetic. You can be like a hermetic, a Crowley-esque mage, and with a spell book and all the paraphernalia as your focus. Or you could be, someone inspired by Jackie Chan films.
Yeah.
Which was pretty much me.
Yeah, I'm just working on for my TikTok. I was just working on a list of Mage films, which anybody who's read Mage knows that most of the books have this recommended media list in the back. So there are literally, somebody asked, what movies are Mage movies? Well, I can name dozens, but I'm trying to boil it down to boiling it down to TikTok level.
Oh, I do not envy you that. Oh, I mean, the way I approach it when I'm kind of explaining it to my friends is I can kind of give you a tradition focused, like these are sort of like the Akashayana mage films. Like, for example, I think like the one starring Jet Li back in 2001, or like if you want or Hellblazer, is an example of a hermetic or
Yeah,
possibly an orphan.
Constantine. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, Constantine. Um, but really, as in one all-encompassing film that is Mage, that's a hard. I do not envy you that.
Yeah, probably the single most mage movie is probably the original Matrix. But
Yeah,
which I'm curious. People always ask, were they influenced by? I have no idea. I mean, obviously they started working on the Matrix in the mid 90s.
yeah,
So the question of whether or not the Wachowskis had ever even heard of this at that point obscure role playing game, which at that point it's fun. One of the funny things about being a gamer for over 40, almost 45 years, and being in the field for over 30 years is how much the perception of role playing games and what role playing games are changed. I mean, when I first got involved in it in 1979, gaming was this weird little thing that you might find on a few shelves in a hobby store, and then it became satanic.
80s
Oh my
Satanic
god,
Panic.
satanic panic. Everyone, gamers are going to sacrifice your children,
Mm.
and now gaming is so much a part of reality in general. It's so much a part
Yeah,
of media culture that we don't even really think of it. It's not an
yeah,
obscure thing anymore.
yeah.
Everybody plays
A book
games.
I collaborated on with Rosie Garland and Dr. Ian Lamond was published early this year,
Oh,
which
cool.
and included my chapter on role playing games.
Hmm.
And basically, like it's an academic journal looking at like the history of role playing games all the way from initial Satanic Panic all the way through to now, where it's used in therapy. I
Hmm.
interviewed a professional therapist who uses role playing games as a tool for overcoming confidence and body dysmorphia.
Cool.
And yeah, it's now we've gone this complete circle almost. Like,
Hmm.
it was hated. I mean, it was on 60
Yeah.
Minutes with Gary Gygax and Patricia
Hmm.
Pulling, which was an absolute car crash. And we had films inspired by
Mazes and monsters.
exactly. And now we've
That's
got
true.
films like Dungeons and Dragons.
Hmm.
It was all about the camaraderie. Or you got yeah, a films that we take um the mechanics almost or the tropes of role-playing games and apply it to
Hmm.
cinema, and it's recognized like
Yeah.
hit points, levels,
Hmm.
uh, armor class. Those are all terminology from
Hmm.
role-playing games, and particularly D&D in this case,
Yeah.
but they've
Level
been
up.
level
Everybody
up.
knows what level up means.
You've leveled up. You get another level, and again that came from gaming. And
Hmm.
yeah, we have, geeks have inherited the earth, so to speak.
I'm curious, have you read Technosis, Magic, Myth, and Mysticism in the Age of Information by Eric Davis?
No, but I would love to. But it sounds awesome.
It's a great book. It's a little
Okay.
bit dated because it came out in 1999. He did a revised edition, I think around 2007 or so. But still, it's an excellent, very, very dense, but excellent book about how the roots of the information age are basically sex, drugs, rock and roll, and geek culture. And I mean, they are. And he mentions gaming in there because he describes how so many of the elements of this technology that you and I are using right now and that people are watching us on whenever this gets broadcast, those those technologies came out of people who played D&D, and they incorporated elements of what they experienced and what they enjoyed about gaming into the technologies that they created that we use now and that our world literally depends on at this point. And that to me is fascinating as somebody who has grown up with that, as somebody who started his career in the days before Google existed and Amazon existed, when being online meant you went to you went to a BBS and chatted with somebody who was in an alt group, as opposed to broadcasting stuff on YouTube or having a goddamn computer in your fucking pocket.
Well, yeah, I mean, got to think about it. It's like back in the day, gaming was pretty much the purview of the thinkers, the nerds, for want of a better term, the geeks. the social outcasts and for whatever that weren't sporty, that weren't as that weren't popular. And then now these people are now in all positions of authority because we studied, we kind of went into university. We're now in positions of authority where we kind of take that language that we learned during our formative years and apply it to what they're working on.
Yeah.
So it makes absolute sense to me.
Hmm.
I mean, like I spoke like dozens of people I know. I was talking to the actor that played Witch Antilles, and he
Hmm.
said like that he was speaking to some people in the Navy, and that a lot of Navy recruits, especially in like TAC Command, join because they've read the Lensman books by Doc Smith, and they want to do TAC Command like it was in those novels. And it was like
Uh-huh.
they're almost disappointed that it's not like that, but it's that inspiration, and
Hmm.
it kind of it your inspirations lead you where you go.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned the therapeutic elements as well, because my late girlfriend, Coyote Ward, we met at a gaming convention, and she was on the autistic spectrum. As it turns out, in hindsight, I am as well, although far less obviously so. She was fairly. She's one of the people that back in the day, people would look at and go, oh, what's with her? Well, um, she had a lot of challenges interacting with other people, and role playing games, as she told me, role playing games gave her a structure and a toolkit with which to interact with people. So that even if she wasn't, if even if she didn't necessarily understand what they wanted from her, she could rephrase it in gaming terms so that she could communicate back to them in a way that they would understand. Uh, and role playing games build a bridge, and I think one of the reasons that they're good at that is because so many uh, ND people, neurodivergent, neuro non-typical, whatever phraseology. The phraseology itself is definitely a work in progress at this point.
Oh,
People can have worked in the field and continue to work in the field.
yeah, well, one thing I noticed in my research is that during March and April 2020,
Mhm.
is gaming spiked.
Yeah.
Just as the lockdowns came down, everyone started role playing online, and that
Hmm.
wasn't just people shifting from in person to online, but also people that were locked down in quarantine for the first time in their lives, couldn't go out and do anything,
Yeah.
started role playing, and it continued. People kept doing it because role playing gives you a platform for conversation.
Yes, exactly. My wife, Sandra Damiana Swan, who coined the absolutely phenomenal term, which we quoted in Mage 20. Mage, or rather, magic. Magic is the fine art of getting off your ass and doing something. um, Sandy had gone from being a casual gamer to during the pandemic, someone who has used video gaming and the community around video game streamers in particular as her primary social outlet during the pandemic, and just found that that level of interaction actually suits her much better than having to go out and deal with people in person.
And that's also surprised. I mean, it has enabled a lot of things. I mean, Mage has been a fundamental part of my life ever since I started playing it. I mean, it inspired me. D&D was like introduced to me gaming.
Mhm.
The White Wolf games introduced me to the power of gaming and like the potential. But Mage is the one that really fundamentally inspired me. It allowed me. It proved to me that no, if you want change, you have to go out and do that change yourself. You can't wait for that change to happen because someone will change it for you. You have to go out
Yes.
and make the change that you want. And it was kind of that kick in the head that I needed. And I went out there and I kept went there and I keep doing it. And like, and I don't know, I've got to do it myself. And like I say, I started out as a engineer and it wasn't doing me any good. I was working from home a lot of the time. I didn't see my kids much because I was leaving the house at 7:30, getting back at 7:30. Now I don't know, I'm going to become a writer. I know what I want to do. I worked my ass off, but I said, I can't just wait to become a writer. I have to go out and become a writer. And I needed that thinking, which kind of Mage taught me. But you have to have the willpower. You have to have the determination to go and do it. Because if you don't do it, you're not going to do it.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, and other people will do it for you.
Exactly. And I was, and again, people kind of say, "Oh, you might want to go back to university and do this." No, I've already gone to university. Thank you very much. I do not go and need to study another degree. So
Mm-hmm.
push me. No, I've done it. Thank you. Once was enough. But and I enjoyed my time at university. But trying to tell someone who's married with two children that need to go to university and have a job as well, I was like, no, thank you. So I cut my ties and went freelance, and it's my only regret. I didn't do it sooner.
Excellent. Congratulations.
Thank you
What are
very
you
much.
working on? You
I'm
mentioned
a
that before.
freelance journalist. I write for the BBC, Computer Weekly, IT Pro. Mostly cover cybersecurity, but also I'm the editor of Geek Pride,
Mhm.
and basically I write for anyone. But yeah, it's but again, if it wasn't for Mage, that almost taught me that mentality, that I probably wouldn't be here. And that is actually quite mind bending to think about. Because I mean, it's just a role playing game, but then we come back to that discussion of like role playing games are used in a because it can be used to teach you skills that you need.
Yeah.
Like during the pandemic, I was running games, role playing games for my children, and it demonstrated them like negotiation. It demonstrated them mental arithmetic. They had to work together, they had to collaborate, they had to kind of manage themselves. And they go, well, we've got this sword, well, you're the fighter, you have sword. We've got this skull, well, you're the mage, you have the skull.
Mhm.
And it kind of just taught them how to manage all that. And again, role games are incredibly powerful, and mage especially because again, you are the mage, if you want to make change, you have to make that change for yourself. But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And like we get into like to it's 20th, well, we're now the 30th anniversary of Mage. I mean, where do you see Mage going from here? Oh, is that a weighted question?
Well, it's that real where Mage goes from here depends on two things. On one hand, the fans, which I maintain as I said earlier, that ultimately Mage belongs to the fans, not to me, not to the IP holders. It belongs to the fans. And then on the other hand, there is the company that owns the rights to Mage, and they have some very different ideas about that. And I'm not going to go into that because I make it a point not to trash people I work with much.
Fair enough. Well, all I'll say is once spoke to Justin Achille a couple of years ago, and I asked him
Mhm.
because I'm a massive Mage fan. So what's are we going to get M5 and Mage, a fifth edition of Mage? And he said, I am the World of Darkness brand manager, not the Vampire the Masquerade brand manager. Make of that what you will, said. Okay.
Mhm.
But other than that one, we've had Hunter and we've had Werewolf, which has just come out at Gen Con as we speak.
Yeah.
So I mean, but then again, a sphere system is just such a wonderful mechanic
Mhm.
because
Yeah, that's okay.
it's great. It works. That's the thing. It works so well because
For, for, for some, for some people, as the person who has wrestled with trying to make it comprehensible for 30 years, some people it's very intuitive. I mean, because that's the way it. And to give credit where credit is due, the sphere system is the creation of Travis Williams and Andrew Greenberg, uh, and it was rooted in the improvisational magic system of Ars Magica, and in its original its original version was written in like 2 weeks and not play tested, um, and so part of my journey with Mage was to make that actually work, was as you said, to put it into there's this stage, then this stage, then this stage, then this stage, and to make that system flow through focus, which we redefined a number of different ways, and finally redefined, I think, in a way that works best in Mage 20, as focus is your belief, your practice, and your tools. Your belief is how you believe magic works and why you believe magic works. Your practice is how you put that belief in, how you put that belief into action. Your tools are the things that you use as you put your practice into, as you put that belief into practice. It took us a little while to come up with that, and it can be a very intuitive system for the right people, and other people find it absolutely incomprehensible. So it really depends on the gamer. Um, I don't know whether they will carry that through in fifth edition or not. I do not know that I am not that I am not part of that process, but I have not been in discussions about that process for quite a while with the M5 process. So my guess is probably not. So I don't know what they have in mind for that.
Well, I'm not going to discuss about M5 because we know nothing. There's nothing to be
Mhm.
said, so
Yep,
there's no point to
exactly.
discuss. But I think, like as you said, M20 edition of the Sphere, I think it's probably, well, obviously the best iteration because it's been iterated and developed, and it just works for me. I mean, there's always going to be discussion of can you do that with that level of that sphere, or can you do, or is it that level? There's always,
Mhm.
and that's subjective based on the GM, and you kind of have to say the GM is the final authority on that because it's so subjective.
Yeah.
But for me, it kind of the sphere system rewards imagination. You have to be
Mhm.
creative.
Yes.
You can't just say, well, I have these spells. Well, no, it doesn't work. You have these spheres of influence, and the only limitation is your mind, is your creative. How imaginative do you want to be? Can you be?
Mhm. Well,
And
and what you can get away with doing,
exactly, yeah.
whether or not you can actually make the whether or not you can actually make the role, and whether or not what you're trying is too hard for reality to accept.
But
Um,
again, you need that kind of like restraint.
oh yeah.
Otherwise, I think it's because I like the idea of like the mages are kind of scurrying in the shadows
Mhm.
because they're hunted. They are very few, and there's that kind of, yeah, paradoxes that like people that change reality.
Which people change reality? How is the question? I don't get into that in Mage 20, especially, but no, on in some ways, the people who change reality are the people who decide what reality will be
Yeah,
in this world, but they're not riding around on broomsticks throwing fireballs. They're posting memes on Twitter. They're buying social media companies, yeah, and
yeah.
platforming certain people and deplatforming other people. That's absolutely reality control. We get into that in Mage 20.
Yeah, I mean, I,
Um,
I think you mentioned as well. I think in the latest Law of the Tradition, or no, I'll say it again, Law of the Traditions. You mentioned actually how the COVID conspiracy theories are like of the anti-vaxxers came about because a certain platform was popularizing misinformation, like how there's chips in vaccines, and it was just like um, I had an argument with an acquaintance, and they were saying, "Oh, like I'm not getting a vaccine. Why not?" I said, and like my parents live far away, 150 miles away. I couldn't see them. My dad had just been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and I couldn't go see them because I couldn't go across boundaries. And he said, "Oh, it's just all bullshit. It's COVID's bullshit." I said, "No, it's real.
no.
It's very real." I said, yeah, but also we've got like chips in vaccine to get chips. No, no, you've got a smartphone. You have a sat nav. That is how they track you. They do not need to put a microchip in a vaccine just to track you. But that thinking was popularized online and some really deep, dark rabbit holes out there. So
Mhm.
you're absolutely right. It's like people are kind of changing their perception of reality to match
Yeah,
their ideology.
that's I get into that. It's eerie when I did the Book of the Fallen, which I wrote in 2017, 2018. And there's a group in there called the Xes, as in extermination level event, and they're an offended group, and the Fendi believe that the ultimate enlightenment is oblivion. And the Xes, their goal is the destruction of life, all life on Earth, and or all human life. And they are so extreme that even other Nefandi are oppose them because because those Nefendi don't want the party to end, and the Xyz would end the party for
Yeah.
everybody. But one of the Xyz tools is pandemics, and one of their instruments in that tools is conspiracy theories, and there is a whole like subplot, potential subplot in there where somebody creates, the one of the Xyz creates a pandemic and has a bunch of people, celebrities, who spread anti-vax rumors, and to see that fiction become reality less than 2 years later, it was disturbing.
I can imagine. Yeah. I mean, I remember. Am I correct in thinking that? I think in the M20 book, you wanted to see the question. I think it might have been the player's guide for M20, and there was a question like, will there ever be um like an Aphandic player guide?
Player's guide, yeah.
And you said no, no, never. But then
No,
you've got the Book of the Fallen. Why did you change your mind? If you don't mind me
I
asking.
didn't change my mind. I wrote it the way that I felt, the way I felt it
Okay.
should be written, because it's, as I mentioned earlier, I've had real experience with metaphysical subcultures.
Yeah.
I've lost people to cults. I have experienced the unfortunate realities of what happens when people use black magic, whether you view
Yeah.
that as human psychology, tricks of human psychology, or whether you view that as the movement of metaphysical forces and extra dimensional entities, is depends on what you believe. I know from my experience and my perceptions that those things happen. And so my insistence when people began asking for an Effendi player's guide back in the 90s was, I'm never going to do that, because you don't turn into a 10-foot tall Captain Planet with a body count. You don't turn into a parasitic super corpse. If you're a ghost, you're not affecting the real world. Um, the material world. We'll make an argument about
Yeah.
ghosts and reality, but you do not possess fairy blood probably, but people do practice magic,
Yeah.
and whether or not you can throw a fireball in this reality, and as we experience it, no, you cannot conjure a fireball and throw it down Main Street, but you can create a panic with a video, and that
Yeah.
absolutely changes reality. And you can make as somebody I knew in college, create a cult, convince a number of people to join that cult, um, give them a lot of drugs and have them digging up bodies and sacrificing animals. And I said, I do not ever want to be associated with
Yeah.
something that inspires somebody to do that, or
Yeah.
to think that that's okay. Because when you're dealing with role-playing games, you're dealing with an interactive fantasy as opposed to as opposed to a passive fantasy. Reading a book is a passive fantasy. Watching a movie, watching a TV show, the story happens. You are not a participant in the story. You may have an emotional reaction to it, but you do not change the story because you're watching it or reading it. In a role playing game, you are the story. And so, as a designer, it is imperative to me, having seen people go off the rails with role playing games, and with stuff that's not gaming oriented, but that takes people's minds and fucks with them. I believe it is absolutely imperative as a designer that you realize that when you say you are you're also saying, isn't that cool?
Yeah.
And I didn't ever want somebody to think that being an Offendus was cool. So what I did with Infernalism, The Path of Screams, which I did in the late 90s for a Sorcerer's Crusade, and with the Book of the Fallen, was I said, no. Yes, there are people who believe this. Yes, there absolutely are people who do this. Do you want to be none of them? Rather, do you want to be one of them? I sure as fuck hope you don't, because those people are horrible. And those people do horrendous things. And those horrendous things have a human cost. And in the Book of the Fallen and Fallen Companions, I explore what that cost is, and say, this is what they believe. These are the tools they use. These are how to recognize and counter these tools. Because when I was doing the book, I was like, this has to be something other than the atrocity exhibition. Yes,
Yeah.
I could be, the role playing version of, Otto Dix's paintings of World War One, which, horrified and appalled people. I could do that, but what fun is that? Obviously, when you're designing a game, it has to be entertaining and it has to be engaging, and for me, it has to be meaningful. Um, what meaning do I want to put into this book? Because, and this is, I was answering this question for someone else just yesterday. It's like, why did you do it? I was like, because somebody would have. and I didn't trust somebody who hadn't had my experiences and didn't have my absolute conviction that you have to be careful with this shit. To just do, here's the Nefandi players guy, isn't being a Nefandi Nito. Let's carve up babies. Fuck that. No, because I know that 99.9% of the people who play this game are just going to go, no, this is just fantasy. There's going to be those people in there because, again, we had experience with this at White Wolf. We had people who would call us up going, I need to speak to the author of the Book of Nod. And, put on Andrew or somebody and you're like, hi, I need to speak to Aristotle de Laurent. There is no Aristotle de Laurent. Yes, there is. No, that's fiction. But I actually have met the vampires. I've met this person. There are people who do take this stuff. I mean, I'm glad that Mage has been a positive influence for you. I would not want somebody to want to become Vormos. I would not want somebody to think that creating a pandemic and destroying human life would be a good thing. So I had to and emotionally, this was a very, very hard book to write because I had to make sure I submerged myself for a while in human depravity, and not the cool, fun kind, but no, this is, selling kids, selling kids out of a truck is not neat and fun, but people do it. Promising somebody a better life and then taking their passport and turning them into your slave is not cool and neato, but there are people who do it. Creating a conspiracy that leads to somebody shooting up a pizza place may have been fun and neat for Alex Jones, but it sure as hell wasn't fun and neat for the people in that pizza place.
Yeah.
Or for the guy who went to jail for shooting it up. And that to me, and we were talking about this a little earlier, how we are in the middle of a real reality war, was absolutely essential for me when writing the Book of the Fallen and Fallen Companions, which is stuff that I'd started writing for the Book of the Fallen I knew wouldn't fit, so I put it aside and then wrote a book around it later, are about recognizing the people who really are shaping our reality in real life, not with broomsticks and fireballs, but with memes and with broadcasts, and recognizing how those people endanger our lives, endanger our societies, and endanger our health. And really, really do fuck with our minds, like that guy I knew back in college. I'm still in touch with one of the people whose minds was fucked with by that guy almost 40 years ago. He's still a mess. That's how much damage that these people can do. And so for me, the Book of the Fallen is not a player's guide to Nefandi.
Yeah.
It's a guide for how to recognize the real Nefandi and how to oppose them, because we have to.
Yeah, absolutely. I've read the Book of the Fallen, and it is a harrowing book to read, absolutely harrowing. And I came out with the general feeling, no, I don't want to play one, and I just tend to stick.
Good.
Yeah, and I just generally stick to putting them in my games as being the enemy that everyone has no problem punching. It's like the Nazis. You have no problem punching a Nazi. And in Mage, I mean, yes, now we have that kind of grey morality between the traditions and the technocracy and the disparates and the marauders. But it comes like there's some do some very shitty things to each other. But it comes to Nefandi, punch him.
Yeah.
If there is that, flat responsive, punch him.
Yeah. And yet, and this is one of the things that the Book of the Fallen and Fallen Companions are about. Yes, most people want to punch Nazis, and yet Nazism is resurgent in our real world. Fascism is resurgent in our real world. We are former president here, and some people still think he is the president. Talk about reality wars.
Yeah.
But our former president had a managerial advisor who is a actual fascist, who is a fan of Julius Evola, and who talked about Julius Evola was one of the great minds of the 20th century. Julius Evola was so fascist that he thought Mussolini was too literal. But we had Steve Bannon in the Oval Office telling the president to be more like Julius Evola. We have people in this world right now who are wearing Nazi armbands, who are flying Nazi flags, who are throwing Nazi salutes, um, who feel that that's perfectly okay. And I felt it was absolutely imperative. It's one of the reasons I did the Book of the Fallen and Fallen Companions, to understand that Nazis are not just some, and Nazis, fascists, whatever word you want to use, are not just some abstract cartoon villain to punch in an Indiana Jones movie. They are the people who are really there, and those people have reasons for what they do.
Yeah.
Does that mean that I think you should play a Nazi? Fuck no. I think you should fucking punch a Nazi. But it is
Yeah.
important to understand why a Nazi does what he or she does, why the Nazi believes, and more to the point, how they can get you to believe that's a good thing.
Yeah.
One of the influences on the Book of the Fallen was that we lost some friends to not even to QAnon. We lost some friends to MAGA, and they were good people.
Oh.
This was, um, they were. I one of them for a while. I considered, I called him brother, and yet the tactics that the people who, the red pillars, that's how he got into the, talk about ironies and reality wars, how a bunch of people took a film by two trans filmmakers, in which a multicultural, diverse, genderqueer cast discovers that reality is more, is more than what they're given, and then these people turn that realization into something that is used to attack trans people, queer people, female people, and non-white people. Right there is a perfect example of real life reality wars and real life reality war tactics. But these people, the red pillars, convinced our friends that, I'm still not sure exactly how they did it, but basically they found their way into our friends' thinking process and convinced them that it was actually more rational to view us, the people who, the diverse, queer, trans, pagan people who had welcomed our friends as family, that we were the bad guys, and we lost our friends to that. And so with the Book of the Fallen and Fallen Companions, I was like, here's how to recognize the games that these people play with your mind, because I don't want to lose any more people to that, and I sure as fuck don't want those people in charge of my reality.
Absolutely not. No. And I mean, like, were you involved in like the book of the Lord of the Editions as well?
Yeah, actually, I wrote the first half of the introduction, and I wrote the Cult of Ecstasy. Talk about how life experiences will change your views. Um, I wrote the chapter on the Cult of Ecstasy, and I was also that was a very collaborative book in which the authors, talk to each other about how do we think. And this is a good example of the changes in Mage over the last 30 years, because in first edition, Mage first edition was written by a bunch of 20 something suburbanites, not all of whom were white kids, but most of us were white kids. Um, who had grown up with a particular set of realities and assumptions in media. It turns out that some of those things were really flawed and really wrong. And one of the core ideas, and I addressed this in the book of Secrets, in the essay "Magic and the Fascist Urge." One of the core ideas in first edition Mage was change reality for magic and win the magic. Isn't it neat that you can blow up a city block because you want to bring magic back to the world? What if you happen to be one of the people living on that city block? What if you happen to be, what if you got burned in that fire? What if you lost your home? What if, your husband or your wife or your girlfriend or your roommate or your kid got killed by that wizard who thought that they should bring back the mythic age? And that's where a big part of, because I had grown up in that kind of neighborhood where one of our neighbors was shot by was shot, and one of our neighbors was beaten with a baseball bat. He deserved it, but he was beaten by a gang that broke into his house, broke into his room, which was downstairs from where me and my then wife were living, and beat him almost to death with baseball bats. And I not grew up in, but I spent several years in a neighborhood like that. So I brought this perspective of, it's not that neat. Yes, it's great that you believe in bringing back the old ways. What happens to the people who are caught in what you think the old ways should be? And as that became more and more a part of our real reality in the time since 1993, I felt it was important to address flat out the idea that one of the core ideas in Mage was itself problematic, um, which was the idea that you should claim reality. Whose reality for whom, and how are you claiming it, and what effect does it have on people? You should really think about this. Um, how this ended up how this ended up playing out through critiquing that idea is very much a part of the Mage 20 line in general. Um, and I felt like even for the most benevolent groups, it was important to look at exactly what it was you were trying to bring about and how you were trying to bring it about, and that maybe instead of fighting over it, we should look at the bigger picture and unite to save our world, first from the people who would destroy us if they could, or who would rule us if they could, and also from the consequences of our own actions. Climate change, hello. In Lore of the Traditions, part of what we were getting at in that book is how not only the traditions themselves changed in a meta plot stance from the medieval group of wizards that they were in the very beginning to the 21st century shapers of reality they are now, but also how the game itself, on a meta level, how the game itself has changed from throw a fireball into at home and why. And in the Lore of the Traditions, we all showed it also had a much more, Lore of the Traditions also has a much more culturally diverse writing crew. Instead of white folks or white folks once removed writing about dream speakers, James Sombrano, who is Chiricahua, wrote the section on the dream speakers from an indigenous American standpoint. Instead of having people who watched a bunch of kung fu movies and read a few read a few books of Chinese philosophy writing about the Akashiana, we have Hiro Makota, who is a Japanese American author, write about the Akashiana. And in the case of my chapter, The Cult of Ecstasy, which was that in itself was a journey, and I'll stick that pin in that tangent for a moment. But in the case of The Cult of Ecstasy, I took it from sex, drugs, and rock and roll are awesome, dude, into so about consent and about whether or not it's okay to initiate somebody into the Cult of Ecstasy when they're 12. And how do you initiate them into the Cult of Ecstasy when they're 12? Should you do that at all? No, not when they're 12. Should you maybe do that at a certain age? Well, it depends on whether or not they want it. And so I made that very much the fulcrum of the approach that I took to the Cult of Ecstasy in 20, I think I wrote that chapter in 2021. But in any case, my real life experience had changed significantly since 1993. And part of that real life experience, and this is where the pin comes out of the tangent. So when the Cult of Ecstasy was originally presented in Mage First Edition, it was and obviously it needs more substance than that. And Daniel Greenberg and I talked about it when working on the book of Shadows in '94, how to give the Cult of Ecstasy substance in terms substance rather than substances, and view their perception of how reality has changed as a personal journey through challenge rather than as yes, fireball. And in the Cult of Ecstasy tradition book, I ended up having a journey of my own because the original author I had hired for it was not able to wrap their head around what I had in mind, in part because I wasn't entirely sure how to present the cult. And so choked up a hairball on it, and I wrote the book in 2.5 weeks. In the process of writing the book in 2.5 weeks, which fortunately I had enough real life experience in actual ecstatic practices that I was able to just basically wing it off the top of my head. But in the process of doing that, I ended up doing an unintended reflection on myself. because at the time that I wrote the Cult of Ecstasy tradition book, I was Cassie. The framework for the first edition Cult of Ecstasy tradition book is there is a person who is a person named Cassie who has great power potentially, but is afraid to use it, and who has restrained herself in many regards of how she lives her life because she's afraid of how she's going to be perceived by other people. And she meets this person who resembles her, um, who is like, cut the bullshit, cut the fucking bullshit, wake up, you need to be more awake. You need to take your power. You need to use it. You need to explore. You need to break all the chains of who you think you are, because this isn't you. And if I'm going to give you this chance, and if you don't take this chance, I'm going to walk away. You will never fucking see me again. You'll spend the rest of your life wondering who you could have been. And the book is the journey of Cassie becoming Arya, and recognizing that Arya, the person who is like, wake up, is not a separate person at all. Arya is Cassie's vision of the future. The avatar, which is a concept in Mage, can take many different forms. The avatar is basically your awakened self who talks to your current self and challenges you to learn more and be more. In the case of Cassie and Arya, Arya is a vision of Cassie's future self. The Cult of Ecstasy or also Time Wizards is a whole other thing with that. But in any case, in the course of writing the Cult of Ecstasy book, I realized that I was telling myself to wake the fuck up and stop being so locked down about so many things. So when I left White Wolf, when I formed my own company, and that company did really well until it didn't. That was the company that produced Deliria Fairy Tales for New Millennium. That's a whole other tangent. We're not going to get into that. But my life broke down again. My marriage broke down again. And I just decided at that point, look, fuck it, man, I'm going to become Arya. So I did. That's when the Satyr, when I adopted the Satyr name, I got involved with even more ecstatic practices than I had been before. I got involved with I had already been to Burning Man several times by that point, but I got really involved in burner culture. Yay! And I, on some levels, that was a phenomenal time in my life, and on other levels, it was a precarious time in my life where I was raped by several of my lovers. I saw people who I considered friends doing things that I thought were atrocious, and so I came out of that experience with a lot of perspective on how your actions affect other people, and how enlightenment is not your excuse, and other people's souls are not your toys. And I literally bring that into the rules of the Cult of Ecstasy in the 21st century when I wrote that. I know, I'll take all those tangents and wrap it back down. So in Lore of the Traditions, I write about how the Cult of Ecstasy, who are now rechristening themselves the Sahaya, which was their original name, but how there's a struggle now within the Cult of Ecstasy between the people who are like, dude, check out this guitar solo, it's otherworldly, and the people who are like, so about that 16-year-old you initiated without looking at whether or not they should be initiated at 16. Let's talk about that. And the Cult of Ecstasy is having that wake-up call of these tools, which historically are, it's not just our creation, it's not just our fictional creations. One of the things that we did a lot in Mage and continue to do in Mage a lot is make fiction out of reality. And so there is not a real life Cult of Ecstasy, but the tools that are employed and the paradigms that the Cult of Ecstasy employs are real practices, are real tools, are things people actually do in this real world. And so in real tantric practices, in real sex, drugs, and rock and roll, subcultures, in real work with entheogens, mind expanding, quote unquote, drugs, smart drugs, and so forth, there is a lot of questionable behavior historically. And what I did in the Cult of Ecstasy chapter for Lore of Traditions was call that on the carpet and go, so these are things you should think about.
And it's discussion that needed. I mean, where do you go from here? I mean, you've written all the traditions. Can we expect more traditional books? Are you going to work on to new things? Where does Sata go from here?
Satyr is currently working on his own stuff. I
Excellent.
because thank you, because I don't want to get into a big tangent about this. Let's just
Yeah.
say that I have been in this business. I've been in the role playing game business for 31 years. I've been writing professionally for almost 35, and the majority of the things that I have written have been work for hire, which means that I create things that other people profit off of. And for a while, that was not a bad trade off. When you go from working in a shoe store for $5 an hour to having a $25,000 a year salary plus benefits, that's a pretty awesome trade-off. Yeah, but when you're writing for 3 to 5 cents a word for something that somebody else who was literally a child when you wrote it is profiting off and you're not, and they're making movie deals off it, and you are not even going to be mentioned, much less see the reward for that. We're seeing this a lot with the MCU and the DCU.
Yeah.
It is exactly the same situation in the role-playing game field. Exactly the same. The business model was the same. People create things. The creators create things. I guess here is the tangent, I guess. But people create things for, a few bucks, and 20, 30, 40 years down the line, some bunch of billionaires is selling them and making movies off of them. And those people who created those things are completely shut out. And those people are on assistance. Those people are, one of the things that made me as vocal as I have become about it is that my longtime Mage collaborators who also worked on Werewolf and Changeling, Nikki Ray and Jackie Cassida, they were living in a trailer. And Jackie died of COVID, and Nikki had COVID but didn't die, but has been left with significant health problems. Both of them were in their 70s, and these people wrote hundreds. They worked on hundreds of role-playing game supplements. They are literally some of the architects, not only not only of the World of Darkness, but of Dungeons and Dragons. They worked on Ravenloft and so forth. And Nikki almost lost her home. Nikki almost wound up in the street at 70 years old because of this business model. And a bunch of us did a fundraiser. And fortunately, Nikki was able because the fans and fellow professionals said, we don't want Nikki Ray to wind up on the street. They have and continue to give money to keep Nikki going. But that is a fundamental problem in this fucking business model.
Yeah.
Is that the people who created Superman, Captain America, Wolverine, Mage, Vampire, Dungeons and Dragons, etc. The majority of us wound up with fucking nothing. And yeah, I had a decent salary 30 years ago, but I don't get a fucking cent off of it now. And, Hollywood is optioning the World of Darkness. Not a single creator of that World of Darkness is going to get a fucking cent from that. And yes, at this point, I am angry because we are now in our 50s, 60s, 70s with nothing to show but bragging rights and a shelf full of books. And we have fans. That is awesome. I love the fans. Folks like you are why I keep doing this. But what the future looks like for Phil Brucato is to stop selling my creations to make other people rich.
That makes sense.
I've worked,
Yeah.
thank you. I've worked on several dozen intellectual properties, and several of them are multi-million-dollar intellectual properties, and I don't get royalties or residuals from any of them.
Yeah. That reminds me of Harlan Ellison's classic video,
Yep,
pay the damn
always get
writer.
paid. Pay
Pay
the
the
writer.
writer. Pay the writer. He was approached by, I think, Warner Brothers for a Terminator film.
No, the
Really,
Terminator was inspired by two of his short stories and an
yeah.
episode that he wrote for the Twilight Zone. Yeah,
And
not the
yeah,
Twilight Zone. It wasn't the
The
Twilight Zone.
Man
It was
with the
the
Glass Hand, I think, was the name of one of the short
yeah, demon
stories.
demon with the glass hand.
Yeah,
Demon with the glass hand. It was fuck, it wasn't Twilight Zone. It was the Outer Limits.
Outer Limits.
Outer Limits.
Yeah,
But that's the same. It's the same thing. The people
yeah.
who worked on Outer Limits, people who worked on Twilight Zone, people who worked on Doctor Who, everybody was paid a salary or it was work for hire. These intellectual properties have legacies, long tails that are decades old at this point, and fans who have grown up on them and who, as you said earlier, have been influenced, but the people who created them, unless they were George Lucas, get nada.
Yeah.
And that business model needs to change. Fortunately, we have the tools to do that now, which is why Sandy and I have formed our own company,
Oh,
Quiet Thunder Productions, which we actually formed over a decade ago, but we have been publishing my new games and some of my fiction as well. I'm both traditionally published and self-published because that's for the creator,
yeah.
whatever medium that is. Whether that is TV, movies, whatever, you might get a bigger paycheck up front if you're writing for Hollywood, but you retain creative control and you get the rights and you get the royalties. I mean, look at the SAG after strike right now,
Exactly. Yeah, I was
the
thinking
Writers
that.
Guild strike right now. That's exactly what this is about, because we have, once again, we have writers who are creating things that are getting, yeah, sure, you got a $60,000 paycheck for that, and 15% of that went for your lawyer, and 30% of that went for taxes, and a bunch of that went to maintain the rent in your Hollywood apartment. And how much of it do you have 6 months later? And the producers who raked in tons of money during the pandemic are talking about replacing you with AI.
I've
Fuck that.
dabbled. Yeah, absolutely. I know.
Fuck that.
I've dabbled with AI. I've like, I'm
Mhm.
covered technology, cybersecurity. I thought I'm going to have a play with it, and yeah,
Mhm.
it works. It produces basic stuff, but it lacks the humanity, subtlety, and emotional core that writers bring. I once asked it, tell me about Richie James Edwards
Mhm.
from the Manuscript Preachers.
Mhm.
And he told me, yes, he is the lead singer of the Manuscript Preachers. One problem, he's been missing for 30 years and declared dead 20 years ago.
Mhm.
But it was telling me, yeah, Richie James Edwards is the lead singer. No, it's not. No, not anymore. But it doesn't handle that sort of, again, ambiguities or
Or oh, sorry, go ahead.
or conflicts of information.
Mhm.
You can't
There,
handle that.
there's
Go on.
there is a an article that I ran across in my feed a few months ago. 10 greatest songs from Kate Bush. 7 of them were by the band Bush. Not only did you have an AI write that article
Yeah,
from scraping a bunch of sources, but nobody fucking checked it before they posted it online.
absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I can see AI working well in structured, specific sectors. I'm thinking legals, in the legal aspect, where you have laws which they abide by and different statutes and references, like writing letters. That's
Mhm.
apparently is going to be a massive change. But writing stories, no,
You know, and
no,
even
because
writing laws. Do you want somebody? Do you want a computer who has no human experience? One of the important things. I'm not a lawyer, but I
mm,
have enough experience with lawyers and and the contracts
yeah,
um, to know how much human perspective is still required when you're dealing with laws, because those laws affect humans in ways that are hard to foresee unless you are a human, and sometimes even when you are a human who is writing and signing those contracts. Again, back to the writer's strike or back
yeah,
to the work for hire thing. When you're 20, when you're 25 years old, writing game material for this, for this company of people like you seems like a great idea. 30 years later, when the intellectual property belongs to somebody else, and that somebody else is bad mouthing you, and is profiting off of your work, um, that bargain seems like a whole, maybe a less good than it was in the beginning. And I mean, I used AI once, uh, with some of the illustration for Fallen Companions, because partly because it's self-published, was not crowd-funded. By the rules of the Storytellers Vault, you cannot crowd-fund those books. Everything you pay for has to come out of pocket. And I did pay about $1,000 to the artist who worked on it. But one of the artists who worked on it, who is a professional artist and who works in other media, was experimenting with Midjourney and posting her experiments online. It's like, that is badass. And it wasn't badass from a, wow, that looks neat. It was badass from a, that's fucked up. That's fucked up in a way that I want this book to look. So I got a Mid-Journey membership, and I proceeded to construct a bunch of really surreal, fucked up nightmare fuel images that used use the uncanny and inhuman abilities of AI to construct these freakish images that were really disturbing to look at. For that purpose, AI made a useful tool. Then I found out how it was doing those things, whose artwork it was scraping, and then I saw much more to my anger. Um, I watched as my friends on um, uh, the art the art source the art communities. I'm blanking on the names off the top of my head, but my
Okay.
friends were suddenly given this new TOS of, oh, and by the way, anything you post on this can be scraped for AI images. And then I started seeing my friends losing jobs to people who were cobbling together images with AI. I was like, fuck that. It was a useful tool once. It was a fun toy for a few months. But when I see the real, once again, going back to that real long, real life long term effects of something, this is something that took a neat idea and a potentially useful tool and turned it into exploitation of people who I care about. Fuck that. So I won't be using it again.
Absolutely. Well, it's been an hour and a half. I could happily
I do
keep
that.
chatting. I could happily keep chatting to you, Satya, but I'm not going to take up any more of your time. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast today. It has been an absolute joy. Where can our listeners find you on the internet?
I have a Patreon. Talk about supporting the artists. I have a Patreon under Phil Brucato. I have books on both self-published and traditionally published on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and so forth. Drive Through RPG. I have several Mage books that do pay me royalties on the Storyteller's Vault, as well as the ones that I've produced for various different publishers that are available through Drive Through RPG. You can find me on TikTok. You can no longer Twitter. Talk about billionaires destroying the world. I've dropped my Twitter account. I'm still on Facebook. I'm on Blue Sky, and I'm on TikTok, and we'll see how well that goes. And I am um, decidedly emphatic on all of those platforms. You'll find me
Excellent.
there.
Well, yeah, follow Satya. He's absolute fascinating person and read his books. Play Mage, it's a fantastic game. And this is Peter E. Ellison saying goodbye. Take care, and I'll speak soon. Bye.